is the Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Rachna Dayal, who is a global health, biotech, and venture investment expert. As the founder of Sugati Ventures, she supports visionary founders with grit and clarity, investing in transformative health tech startups. Rachna, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Hall, and nice to see you again after, I think, maybe 9 months or something when we met last over a business dinner.
That's right, yeah. So where are you calling from today?
I'm in San Ramon in California. This is where I live and I work out of.
Great. So tell us more about your transition from corporate media, Johnson & Johnson, to early stage venture investing. What were the key lessons you learned and what was the motivations?
I think I've done the transition from big corporations to small startup or investing multiple times. The first time it was when I moved from Philips to actually a very high-tech startup here in the Bay Area. And then the second time was J&J, then to start my own fund here in the Bay Area again. And, the biggest lessons that I've learned in these transitions is to expect the unexpected. When you work in a big corporation, you have a lot of resources at your disposal. And once you set the strategy, there's a whole team of people helping you get that strategy executed and get to success. Whereas in a startup or in a small VC fund, you're basically running the show on very little resources, very small amounts of money, very small but dedicated team. And you're working with very flexible people who can take on multiple roles at the same time. And I think that's a big difference between big corporations and startups and VC.
So, tell us more about the Sugati Ventures thesis around consumer first and purpose-led brands. What defines a standout opportunity?
So it's a health tech fund, and we focused on patient first thesis, right? So the consumer and the end consumer in our case is patients who need help with different diseases, different stages of diseases that they're going through. And we invest in early stage medical devices and AI-enabled healthcare platforms that actually invest in many cases in life-saving devices and solutions, right? And what is very important for us in Sugati is that these solutions are filling a very high unmet need in the marketplace for patients, for clinicians, for surgeons, for provider systems, and for payers, because these are the things that move the needle in the healthcare space, either for longevity or for more years with quality of life. And when you save a life, you save a family. And that's so true. You see it right away in healthcare.
So you focus primarily on longevity and quality of life, or is it broader than that?
It is broader than that, but life-saving devices will increase longevity, right? So it's an indirect impact and it'll improve quality of life. So, in health economics, the quality of life years measures is a very important one. When you think of healthcare outcomes and outcomes with saving lives, either with medical devices or pharmaceutical drugs, or with a healthcare platform that does prevention, or it does early diagnostics. So there's a lot of angles to consider when you think about longevity and quality of life and health economics.
So how do you evaluate founder market fit in this product space? It seemed like it might be of a challenge.
It is a challenge, but it's also a very rewarding space. In healthcare, I would say in many cases, we look for founders who have experience in healthcare. They've either worked in healthcare in one way or the other. Those tend to be very strong, solid founders. The other set of founders I'm very, respectful of are people who've gone through either health challenges themselves, or they've lost a family member, or they're struggling with a family member going through major health challenges. These are very passionate and driven entrepreneurs who end up designing solutions that really help patients overcome challenges in either oncology or immunology or whatever else the disease space might be. And one of the startups that I've invested in, Oatmeal Health, was actually one of the founders started that because his dad was going through oncology challenges, right? Struggling with cancer, and early diagnosis of cancer would have actually been so much more beneficial. So he's now dedicated his life to developing a solution that can help raise flags and detect cancers earlier. And so it's either people who've really worked for a long time in healthcare and they understand healthcare, or people who are driven by the passion because they've been hurt, either themselves or the family members have been hurt through diseases.
Hmm. So you invest in mission-aligned commerce and wellness brands. What are the trends you're seeing in those segments?
I wouldn't say I invest directly in wellness. What I'm seeing in healthcare right now is that healthcare is really being helped by technology developments. And what do I mean by that? So when you think about AI penetrating healthcare, we're starting to see a lot of benefits because AI can help provider systems optimize a lot of things. When you think about ambient scribe, consider something as simple as ambient scribe for clinicians. It allows clinicians to provide more focused time with their patients when they're talking to them because the ambient scribe is taking all the notes and it doesn't miss anything. And, at the second stage of development, the ambient scribe actually gets connected to the EHR system where it can draw on notes that were taken earlier and it can look at the patient history. Then AI can combine all of these together to actually point out any red flags that either a nurse or a clinician might have missed, right? So think about that AI helping with healthcare. Another angle of technology helping healthcare is there's a lot of developments on the nanoparticle side. And what that's leading to is developing structures that can help patients heal faster in case of surgical wounds or trauma wounds. One of the companies I've invested is Tempo Therapeutics, and that leverages nanoparticle innovation that is injected into the human body to create scalpels that then help with tissue regeneration way faster than normally a human body can do on its own. And if you're regenerating tissue 2x or 3x faster, it's actually saving lives. You're avoiding costly infections and you actually improving health outcomes. So these are the kind of technologies that are loved by patients, by clinicians, but also payers love them, right? And in healthcare, all three have to align for the magic to actually happen and be sustainable. So those are the kind of things and trends that I'm watching very closely and investing in because I think technology is the next enabler for healthcare I think for the foreseeable future of next 10 to 20 years, to be honest.
Great. Well, let's talk about the role of culture and storytelling in brand-driven investing. Storytelling is a key component for getting the message across, but what are you seeing there?
So I think storytelling is very important. And when it comes to healthcare, storytelling, changes very drastically depending on who you're pitching the solution to. Like if your brand and your product is targeting end patients, if it's a prevention platform that you're targeting for your end consumers and patients, the storytelling is very different than when you're actually selling to a hospital system that may have 70 hospitals, across a very broad region or all across US, right? And then again, when you're going to payers and selling something to payers, payers care about health economics calculations. It's a very numbers driven game for them. So then the storytelling becomes very, very different, unlike standard consumer products, I would say. So I would say in healthcare, for founders, it's very important to know who the end customer is, who's buying, who's making the buying decision and paying the dollars. And based on that, you have to tell the story accordingly. At the end of the day, though, if you're not improving human health and human life in healthcare, there isn't really a purpose for you in the long term. So I see a lot of flashy solutions come and go in healthcare, but only the ones that can truly move the needle on human health trajectory, those are the ones that remain for the long term.
Right. So, what's been your experience in supporting diverse and underrepresented founders? What have you found out there so far?
I've seen a lot of grit, a lot of resilience in underrepresented founders because they have to have it. And I also find that underrepresented founders represent different aspects of culture, gender, location. To me, an underrepresented founder could be somebody coming from a different ethnicity, but they could also be coming from an area in US, which is a remote area, right? Because they're not part of the Silicon Valley, network or the East Coast network in healthcare. To me, diversity has multiple angles. And I find people who come from different aspects of life tend to have a different approach to problems, which can lead to new innovations. And, we in healthcare don't just have to serve the most populated cities, we have to serve rural healthcare as well. People who reside in rural areas that may not be living close to a hospital. And so we need this, ingenious minds to actually devise new solutions that serve all of US and all of the globe. and not just, the areas where money and power is concentrated. So I have a lot of respect for people from all aspects of life, because without differences in thought processes and differences in innovation, we cannot serve US as a whole, as a country.
Very good. So we're in the post-pandemic market now. The world's a little bit different than what it was. In some ways, it's very different. But how do you build consumer trust and loyalty in a post-pandemic market?
So during the pandemic, one thing that we saw in venture capital was unrealistic valuations. If you think about the year of 2021 and part of 2022, people were floating whatever billions of dollars numbers on papers for valuations and raising rounds on that. And some of us, the more pragmatic people were like, that's wrong valuation. And, the crowd would shut us out and shush us out, whatever you want to call it. And I think in the post pandemic market, reality has set in. And a lot of venture capitalists have actually paid the price heavily for agreeing to those crazy valuations of 2021. So a lot of the portfolios from that era are either not profitable or will eventually die out because of the unrealistic valuations. The second thing that I'm seeing is that, in the post pandemic world, ChatGPT happened. So generative AI and the power of generative AI has become visible to the world. And if you think about the SaaS solutions that were the rage of the last, 10 years pre-pandemic, entire portfolios were wiped out in the SaaS world by generative AI. And so it's a very new reality. It's an ever-changing world. Innovation is hitting very fast, faster than anybody could have imagined. And it's unless you understand the fundamentals of technology and the fundamentals of investing, it's hard to keep up. So what I say is this is no time of investment for tourists. This is for people who hardcore know how returns happen and what business actually means, what it takes to run a business through good and bad times. And that's sometimes in a way, in a sense, purging and cleansing is happening.
So are we going to see more down rounds? And is down round just the sign of death, or is it, just fruits for those who agreed to such erroneous valuations?
I think not all down rounds are a death statement. But we have seen a lot of down rounds, not thankfully, touchwood, not in my portfolio of investments at least, but there have been a lot of down rounds. There's been a lot of flat rounds. And I would say flat rounds are commendable. If you're coming out of valuations of 2021, a lot of these startups may not survive. That's the reality. That is the unfortunate reality. And I don't know who it is to blame. Is it the founders who pushed for these unrealistic valuations or the investors who agreed to it or because money was almost free? I don't know what to say, or investment bankers or whoever. But the system as a whole did lead to the situation. And the system is seeing a crunch on capital. It is not as easy to raise money today as it was in 2021. It's actually very hard for startups right now. And I don't think every startup that is going through a down round is going to die, but a majority of them are going to not exist after the next 5 years. That's the reality.
Well, I've talked to many LPs who put money in during that time, and their thought is they're going to give more money to the VC when they get something back from the VC. How long are we going to be in that stalemate until we kind of get this through the system and we're back to a functioning system? Is that a year away, 3 years away, 5 years away? What do you think that's going to be?
I think you just asked me $1 trillion question, and I don't know if anybody in US knows the answer to that, given how things shift on a weekly, daily basis. Nobody knows what's coming down the pike. But I think once you start seeing liquidity in real estate, once you start seeing liquidity in infrastructure, it can impact venture capital as well. There will be more liquidity. The investment levels are not going to be as high as in 2021, 2022. I'm not expecting that. But the thing is also, it's not just real estate, crypto is also down at the same time, right? So nothing's really at its peak, so to say. And except maybe generative AI and OpenAI and Anthropic, and now we hear Mira Murati is able to raise $1 billion for a new company. I think there are very narrow niches that are getting funded. Everything else is starved. And it's going to take a couple of years at least, if not more. And the wars are not helping, I'll be honest with you.
So we hear a lot about there's still substantial dry powder out there in the funds, although many VCs say, well, that's for existing portfolio companies. We don't know what they need. But is that true? Is there plenty of dry powder and is it available for new deals?
So there are two phenomena that I've noticed, right? One, there is some dry powder, that is the truth, and that is being kept for portfolio companies that might be doing better than the others. So people are betting on their winning horses, I would say, right? And so they're keeping the dry powder for future rounds and follow-up rounds. And that's not an unwise strategy. The second thing that is not getting talked about as much is LPs are defaulting. So you sign up to invest in an instrument and there are three or four capital calls. And right now, if a third or a fourth capital call is happening, a lot of LPs are defaulting. So there is not as much dry powder in the banks of VCs as was promised.
Okay.
And that's the reality. So it's a mixed bag. There is some dry powder, but there is not as much. Maybe with the really big VC firms, like if you think about Lightspeed and those kind of funds, they might be having a lot of dry powder. I certainly don't think that's true for mid-size and small funds.
Nice. Okay. So let's talk about impact investing. What's your thought on, the impact metric versus the financial performance for early stage deals? It seems like we need a balance there, but how do you weigh the two?
So look, Hal, that's a really interesting question because I invest in healthcare. Everything I do is impactful for human health. I'll be very honest with you. And I think the only thing that can have long-term sustainable impact on human health is something that will be profitable. We're a capitalist society. If we do not think of profit, we will not be able to sustain it. And I think for the last decade or so, people have been lost thinking that if you're investing for impact, profits don't matter. You can have very impactful investment, whether it's impact on human health or impact from a perspective of gender or ethnicity, diversity of founders and investors, right? Whatever metric you take, if it's not profitable, it's unsustainable. And that's my take on things. I don't think you should separate the two. One doesn't imply that the other's out of the window. They can work together. You have impactful investments that are very profitable. And I've been saying that for the last decade, over 20 years, however long I've been working, and I will still stand by that.
So would you say if you have strong impact metrics, you most likely should have strong financial performance and vice versa?
I don't think that impact metrics should be separate from performance metrics. They belong together in the same group of measurements, to be honest.
That makes sense. So let's talk about corporate strategy experience that you've built over the years. How does that come into your approach to portfolio support? What do you bring to the table with that?
That's a great question. So during my corporate life, I've done roles where I was working the strategy level, but then also next role, I would go down at an operational, external manufacturing kind of roles where it gets very operational very quickly. And portfolio support requires a little bit of both, right? So the strategy enables you to look at your portfolio and say, okay, I have a startup in the orthopedic infection removal space. Now, if I invest in another startup that can detect infections earlier, in the orthopedic surgical wound space, that's synergistic, right? And non-competing. And the same surgeons would actually want to use both the technologies eventually. So I can see my portfolio helping each other. That's strategic. That's knowing what your network is and how you make your network work, right? That's the strategy part. Where you kill multiple birds with one stone, or you kill 10 birds with two stones, or whatever you want to call it, right? That's the strategic part. In portfolio, helping your portfolio, you also need to go down to the level of the individual startup and say, okay, this is what stage they're in, and this is what takes them to the next level and the level after that. And to be able to get very operational and say, okay, if I don't help them get into these two hospital systems, then it's going to be harder next year for them to show growth and trajectory. So then you get very operational and making the connections, figuring out what their messaging has to be. Does their product need to evolve in a certain shape? Do they need to pivot or not pivot based on market feedback? That gets very operational, very hands-on. You get your hands dirty and you build with them. So the strategy and the operational pieces that I've actually done in corporate life come in very handy across all of portfolio management.
Well, you've been around the block quite a few times here with startups and funds and so forth. What's your advice for emerging consumer VCs or first-time angel investors before they enter the space? What do you tell them to do before they write that check?
So look, I would consider myself still an emerging VC because I haven't been doing it for so long. And you remain emerging VC until you're onto your fund 3 or fund 4. That's the definition. That's the classic definition. So I classify myself as emerging VC. One thing I find very fascinating is I get so much advice from people who've never done VC on how I should do VC that I can't even count anymore. It's like, it's an insane amount of people. And I know it's very well meaning. But my advice to angel investors and emerging VCs who will love to do investments, and this is passion, it comes from a place of passion, is learn from people who've come before you and done it before, and smile and move on from the advice that comes from people who've never done it or will never go ahead and do it on their own. It's amazing. I was stopped in the middle of a medtech conference by a guy who's actually never run a fund. And I don't know if he plans to run a fund or not. And he's like, this is exactly how you should do it. This is how it's actually done. And so I thought he actually ran a fund. And I asked him, I said, well, so how did you do it in your fund? He's like, oh, I don't run a fund. And I said, when you ran it last, he's like, oh, I've never run a fund. I'm like, okay, great, absolutely fantastic. We'll talk in 2 years once you decide if you want to do a fund or not. So I think that is my first piece of advice. If you come from a place of passion and you've got experience in running a business or investing in one way or the other, then go do it. Go do what you want to do. You would be surprised how many people will come out of nowhere to help you if you're really genuine about it. And the second piece of advice, and I really believe in it, is you should invest in things you understand. Otherwise, you lose money because you've got to follow a lot of things. In healthcare, you've got to follow the payers, the providers, the clinicians, the patients, the caregivers, the advocacy, the regulation. It's a lot of it's a big beast to cut and eat in small pieces, right? And if you've not worked in an area or you don't understand it, and sometimes you haven't worked in it, but somebody in your family, close family, like your parents have worked in healthcare, so you understand it very well because it was always part of dinner conversations. Go invest in things you understand. And if you want to invest in new areas, take time to learn before you start investing. I think I'm not ashamed to admit early on, I invested in a company very young that I didn't understand. And I wasted 50K. And at that time in my life, 50K was a big chunk of my salary. But sometimes failure is the best teacher. You burn your fingers once and then you learn and you don't do it again. And so those are the two pieces of advice I would have.
That's great advice. Best I've heard in a while. So in the last few
Thank
minutes that
you.
we've had here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
I have a message for emerging managers as well and founders is that, I know a lot of people are going through very tough economic times and it's fundraising is hard. If you really believe in the product you're creating, if you really believe in the portfolio you're creating as an investment manager, hang in there. Things do change. What goes down will go up. What goes up will go down. We're always living in this, sinusoidal curve and the economy never stays down forever and it never stays up forever. So we might be at the rock bottom, but things will change. I have enough gray hair to know that things don't last forever. So my advice is if your product is really good and it's going to save lives, hang in there. Don't give up yet.
Well, that's great information, great advice. So glad to have you on the show today. How best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
I think I respond to LinkedIn very well. So my LinkedIn is my name, Rachna Dayal. You can find me on LinkedIn. The find name is Sugati Ventures. So if on LinkedIn you find a Rachna Dayal with Sugati Ventures, that's probably me. Reach out to me and I'll respond.
Great. We'll put your contact details in the show notes. I want to thank you for joining us today. Hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Absolutely. Such a pleasure, Holland. Thank you for having me.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.